standing events of the same type that happens all the time between U.S. institutions and counterparts in Europe, in Japan, in Korea. And we think that as the oldest U.S. ally in Asia and an important economic partner, it's high time that we have a similar type of annual event here in Manila. Over the next 2 days, we will have 6 panels on the changing international order, infrastructure collaboration, trade tensions, alliance networking, international crises, and cooperation on emerging technology. We will also have an ambassadors roundtable at lunch today, keynotes by President Marcos tomorrow morning, as well as by Congresswoman Maria Rachel Arenas from the House Committee on Foreign Affairs at the end of the day tomorrow. This event is going to serve as the marquee event for a new CSIS U.S.-Philippines initiative back in Washington, which will be a first of its kind at a U.S. think tank. We plan to use that over the coming years to provide a unique platform to develop the future leaders of the U.S.-Philippines alliance and to build consensus between Washington and Manila on the most pressing policy issues of our day. I will note that there are going to be some changes to the panels 2 tomorrow, which I'll address at the end of the day, but the brochures you have before you for today are entirely accurate and should reflect, if we can stay on time, when things will go. Now, with that out of the way, let me step down and call up our first panel. We're going to have Henrietta Levin, who's a senior fellow with the China program back at CSIS, moderate, and joined by a group of experts from both the U.S. and the Philippines on the topic of new rules of the international order. So please give a hand to our first panel.
Hello. Thank you so much again for joining the inaugural panel of the inaugural Manila Strategy Forum on the new rules of the international order. My name is Henrietta Levin, as Greg mentioned. I'm a senior fellow with the CSIS Freeman Chair in China Studies. And I am excited to be moderating an exceptional panel this morning with leading experts from the United States and the Philippines on how regional and global institutions and norms are evolving at a time when the rules-based international order faces unprecedented strain. So let me start by introducing our fantastic panelists. We have Derek Mitchell, Senior Advisor to the Office of the President at CSIS and former U.S. Ambassador. Charmaine Willoughby, Professor and Chair at De La Salle University in the International Studies Department. John Alterman, the Brzezinski Chair in Global Security and Geostrategy at CSIS. And Herman Kraft, Professor with the University of the Philippines in the Department of Political Science. Of course, this could not be a timelier conversation coming on the heels of Chinese President Xi's apparent doubling down on his own vision of world order, announcing a global governance initiative at the SCO summit in Tianjin. And today, our discussion will explore whether some version of the post-war trade and diplomatic regime, as we've all understood it until today, is likely to prevail, and if not, what might replace it, or what is already starting to. And what is the role of middle powers like ASEAN and the Philippines, especially in thinking about the Philippines' upcoming chairmanship of ASEAN in managing the increasingly revisionist ambitions from President Xi's Beijing and President Trump's Washington? And what does ASEAN centrality mean in this increasingly complicated environment? So with that, we'll turn to the panel, and I'll just ask for brief opening remarks, about 5 minutes from each of our fantastic panelists, starting, if you wouldn't mind, with Derek.
Thank you very much, Henrietta. Good to see everybody here, a remarkable crowd here. It's great to see everybody come out this morning. I want to thank Greg for the invitation. I want to thank Greg and his team and all the folks here locally for organizing this. I've talked to several of you already. I really hope this thing is really the first of many such dialogues. This is overdue to have an alliance dialogue of this nature between the United States and the Philippines, and it's, I think, testament to the development of the relationship in recent years and the seriousness with which both countries view the need to ground this relationship further in coming years. So I'm really pleased to be invited, and I thank you all for coming. Just very briefly on this issue of the international order. First of all, just to get to the bottom line up front, as we say, this is a time of testing. We don't know the new rules of the international order, of the rules these days, but it is a time of testing. And this goes beyond Trump. We'll have plenty of opportunity, I expect, to talk about the Trump administration and President Trump. But in fact, many of the dynamics in the international order, the stress that has been placed on the international order, are there structurally and predate, or regardless of President Trump. Trump, I think, has taken that and exploited it to some degree, or made it much more visible. But the issue, I call it an axis of resentment that's out there, of countries that are filled with resentment who have risen, large powers who have risen, other powers that have felt kept out of the international system, a system that was formed first in the post-World War II era, institutions to underwrite certain rules that were done by the West, folks who were not part of that system, that were those subject to that, whether they were great powers or they were smaller powers, they were put off by both being excluded, but also a sense of American hypocrisy, perhaps. In the United States, a sense of American fatigue itself over its involvement in these rules and what's required of the United States. And I think it's exacerbated by digital technologies, where things just get much harder to manage in that regard. So I think we have to recognize the order is under stress regardless of the situation we're in, but we should obviously be talking about where we are today. Now, that system that is under stress, some people call it the liberal international order. Some say we've never really had a liberal international order. There's questions on that. But there has been certain things that are the rules that we understood. The UN system, the inviolability of borders, the peaceful resolution of disputes, sovereign equality, universal human rights, common security, and the Bretton Woods dialogue in the institutions. And then the process with the WTO, GATT, to have free trade rules. And the idea that we're moving towards a more globalized world under an interconnected world where there's free flow of goods, finance, ideas, and people. There's just free flow. It's an open, globalized environment. And much of that is now under stress by some great powers, but also there's some questions in the United States as well along those lines. And then we had that vindication, America was a hyperpower after the Cold War. That is now all gone. We are a major power, but we are no longer certainly a hyperpower. Now the symptoms of that we see in some of the institutions that are forming. We saw that last week in China, whether it's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization or the establishment of BRICS. To me, that's evidence. Those are symptoms of this sense of resentment or exclusion that the West, so-called, has not been quick enough or done well enough to include. But I would say, even though there is this sort of we want to break what has been there, there's no consensus on an affirmative vision for the new rules. Like, I don't know that, I think the only affirmation you can get between China and Russia and some others there is that we don't particularly like the United States dominating the system or the West dominating the system. We don't want to be subject to whether it's sanctions or those types of things. We want to have more sovereignty, more say, more inclusion. And this is their way of getting power through numbers and sending a signal to the United States. But no consensus on the alternative. We're not seeing, for instance, any follow-up with Trump's policies on, and even China's policies on protectionism to a degree. You're not seeing that ripple through the system and being absorbed as the new model. So there are really questions about what is going to take the place of this older system that is coming under stress and the new system that is waiting to be established. I don't want to go on too long, I said 5 minutes. The final thing I'll say then is two aspects of it related. The testing is coming in very specific terms. The Philippines knows this. The West Philippine Sea, what's happening there is a time of testing of what is the system. Is there going to be rule of law? Will countries stand up and abide by and back the decisions of tribunals and allow, will be might over right or might makes right? Its spheres of influence, all of these things are question marks now of this new system, real time of testing. We see it in Ukraine, of course, we see it in the Taiwan Strait. This is all very, very important. And the final point I'll make on this, I was just making it to a colleague here, is that, and this predates, this is basically drove Biden administration policy, which is we know in the United States we are no longer the hyperpower. We cannot hold this up ourselves. The idea that the Trump administration uses inelegantly, that no more free riders. In fact, without using those sort of blunt language, that's actually true, which is why the Biden administration reached out and strengthened alliances, and why, frankly, a lot of allies came to us. But this is a time of testing for all of us, and the requirement is of all of us, and I think the Philippines are passing that test, so I'm not speaking to this crowd, but to others in ASEAN and others in Asia and others elsewhere. What kind of world do you want to see in the 21st century? That these norms, these rules, these values, these laws, there's now a competition that's ongoing. It's a defining challenge of this century. And it's not a matter of choosing countries, China over the US or vice versa. It's choosing norms, choosing rules. And if the US can't do it alone, then others need to step up and sacrifice. Inclusion comes with the responsibility. To be at the table means you have to take responsibility, and then you have to enforce it. There has to be an enforcement of those. And this is going to be a long-standing challenge, a long-standing competition, and it's something that when we go to Europe, we go to elsewhere in Asia, we use as somewhat of a challenge as we look at the new rules of the system. So with that, maybe I went over my 5 minutes, but I want to throw that on the table, and we can have discussion about the Trump administration, whatever else you want to talk about. Thank you very much.
Great, thank you. And an important reminder of the critical role that the situation in the West Philippine Sea will play in the directionality of many of these broader questions of world order. Charmaine, would you like to weigh in next?
Thank you, Henrietta. Good morning to everyone. It is an honor to be here speaking in front of you today. Thank you very much to CSIS and to Greg for involving me in this conference. I would echo pretty much what Ambassador Mitchell said earlier, that it's very difficult to identify new rules in the international order because things are still evolving. So it's still pretty much we find ourselves in this very fluid time where we don't really know exactly what rules would take root for this new international order. So in my short remarks today, I would make the argument that in order for us to identify whatever new rules seem to be emerging, we need to unpack two things. Number one, we need to first determine what props up the current international order. And here I would also touch upon norms and values that Ambassador Mitchell mentioned earlier. And the second thing that we need to unpack is the role of middle or small powers. So these are the two major points that I would like to highlight in my remarks today. First, let me begin with unpacking international orders. At the heart of any international order, not least of which the order that we find ourselves in today, is a set of norms. The so-called liberal, rules-based international order that we find ourselves in since 1945 acts as the world's operating system, quote-unquote, operating system. The general organizing principle of this multilateral and rules-based order is aimed at managing an open economy and operationalized through international institutions. It's important to note that the American-led liberal order that we see today is a product of the evolution from collective security embodied in the now defunct League of Nations to seemingly a security community via the United Nations. Under this umbrella, the United States created the Bretton Woods system, propped up by the IMF and the World Bank. At the same time, it established security partnerships like NATO in Europe and the hub and spokes model in Asia. Much of the success of this international order rested on the leadership of the United States. Indeed, we can argue that the maintenance of the liberal order has been the main driver of American engagement all over the world. And this has been pretty much the status quo since the end of the Second World War. But since then, this order has also experienced several types of contestations. Now, there are different categories of the way that this order has been challenged or contested. The first is what in the discipline we call as applicatory contestation, where we see the evolution of interactions or relations, for instance, from alliances to partnerships, comprehensive strategic partnerships, from multilateralism to mini-lateralism. This type of contestation demonstrates the order's ability to be nimble and adapt to contemporary dynamics. In fact, as documented in scholarship in the discipline, applicatory contestation is a positive indicator of an order's growth and viability. So in this sense, we can make the argument that the new types of interactions and relationships that we form in today's contemporary era, these are really examples of how we are strengthening the current order. But there's also another type or another category of challenge or contestation, and that is in regard to the validity of the norms and the values of this current order. The US-led liberal order became increasingly, unfortunately, exclusionary despite its global outlook, where it inevitably drew lines between the West and the rest. And in this current nexus, China plays a very strong contender in the context of the decline of the liberal international order. China's vision takes form in the BRI, predicated on connectivity, in policy coordination, facilities, trade, finance, and people-to-people links. The BRI, as we all know, connects China to Asia, the South Pacific, East Asia, and Europe. And the combination, really, of networked capitalism and the national unit reinforces the Chinese government's narratives that portray China as a pioneer in global capitalism. In short, the Belt and Road Initiative justifies a regional order that finds China at the center. And here, the crisis of the US-led international order then becomes even more acute when cast alongside China's version. While China's view of order is not unproblematic, the future of a staggering liberal order is bleak compared to the breadth and depth of a future order with quote-unquote Chinese characteristics. So this is a good example of how the veracity of the US-led rules-based order is really being challenged. And as a validity contestation, this can potentially kill the post-1945 system. The second major point that I'd like to make in my short remarks today has to do with the role that small or medium powers play in this perspective. It is oftentimes assumed that great powers, like the United States, like China, create world orders. And small and medium powers will simply, automatically, or naturally just align themselves with the status quo. But in my own work, I question the automaticity of the choice of small and medium powers. Questioning the automaticity uncovers that small and medium powers actually consciously choose which version of international order to subscribe to, depending on two things. First, domestic configurations, and second, foreign policy expectations. And these two factors are exemplified by the Philippines' critical bilateral relationships, our alliance with the United States and our bilateral relationship with China. These bilateral relationships demonstrate that small powers, like the Philippines, rely on domestic calculations and expectations of foreign policy gains. This explains why there is a swing or an oscillation of our foreign policy in the last two administrations. And it is these factors that then can determine which version of the world order that small powers will subscribe to. The combination of these factors ultimately reveals that small powers like the Philippines will always find ways to accommodate great powers. But we do so, small powers do so, in the hopes of being accommodated in return, in whatever version of an order takes precedence in the end. So these are my 2 points. I hope it can jumpstart our conversation and discussions later. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. John, would you like to weigh in next?
Thank you very much, Henrietta. First, I want to say thank you to Greg and the sponsors. This is my first trip to the Philippines. I've been looking forward to it, and I am looking forward to learning a lot from all of you. I want to start with a little bit of math, and that is to remind us all that the Cold War lasted about 42 years and ended 36 years ago. For 2/3 of Americans alive now, they have no personal experience with the Cold War, either because they weren't yet born or they were still in elementary school when it ended. And for people like me and Derek and for many of us in the room, the Cold War and its connection to a vital US role in the world seemed permanent as we became adults and made sense of the world. That's the way we saw the world through this Cold War prism, and it still feels very real. But to a strong and growing majority of Americans, the Cold War was a blip in the history of the United States and of the world. If we look at broader American history, the overwhelming theme has been that the United States hasn't been very interested in internationalism. The United States spent the entire 19th century conquering the North American continent. Around the turn of the 20th century, US economy surpassed the British economy to be the largest in the world, but Americans always sensed that we had done it in a pure way, which is a little bit ironic when you say it here in the Philippines, right? Because the Americans never saw themselves. We have never seen ourselves as an imperial power. We saw ourselves as a consensual power. I mean, arguably, with the sort of Chinese approach to win-win solutions. That's the way the Americans have always seen themselves in the world. But we haven't had this sense that we needed to grab things for ourselves, and we haven't traditionally sensed that we had this natural role. I was with Derek at the U.S. military cemetery yesterday. It's a very interesting small museum there, and it underlines just how hard it was for President Roosevelt to get the United States involved in World War II. Had it not been for Pearl Harbor, it's not clear how that would have come out. The American instinct, the traditional American instinct, is not to be deeply internationalist. I think much of what the Trump administration has been doing is a departure from history, and I think a lot of it won't be sustained, but it would be a mistake also to assume that the Cold War posture that I think many of you got used to as the normal posture, I don't think we're going back to that either. I think we have to take the longer view that American geography and American neighbors, we have Canada to the north, Mexico to the south, and thousands of miles of fish in either direction, means that for a lot of Americans, it's okay not to care about other countries. I think Americans understand there's sort of a level of interconnectedness between the United States and the world, but I also think that we're all going to have a much larger collective action problem with people saying, well, why should I make a sacrifice if they're not making a sacrifice? Why should I make a sacrifice for them? I think the Trump tariff experiment is going to be relatively short-lived, but I don't see the United States leading once again on issues like the TPP, making large-scale commitments to things like the WTO and so on. We sometimes talk about pendulums in American foreign policy, where they swing back and forth. And the idea is that it reaches extremes, but then it comes back to the middle. And I think we are going to swing from where we are, but I don't think the middle is where things were 10 years ago. I think the Cold War norms are not the center. Instead, the Cold War norms, I think we have to think about as a sustained extreme, and the question is where that pendulum is going to go to. So to finally begin to address the excellent questions you have for the panel, I don't think that the post-war economic and security regimes have lost their relevance, but I do think we're likely to see reduced US efforts to secure them in the years ahead. This may not be an entirely bad thing, because what a lot of us got used to thinking about as US leadership allowed for a certain amount of passivity among American partners. I think we're going to reach new and different equilibrium, which is going to demand both more of a wider range of participants, and which will leave us all in a somewhat different place. Having more dynamism and resiliency is positive, and the resultant structures are going to be better able to address current needs. Still, their transaction costs are going to be higher, and there's going to be more difficulty making long-term investments that diverse electorates are going to support over time. I should add that I'm not entirely convinced that US-China competition is going to frame the entire 21st century. In part, and this is a Henrietta question, what is China's prospects for the rest of the 21st century with demography and other issues? But it's also a function of whether future US governments are going to see China through the same lens that recent US governments have seen China, and even what the Trump administration sees as China, which seems to have very harsh and sharp language, but I don't see actions being so sharp at the current time. There's a second question about the role ASEAN can play in shaping US policy, and I know enough about ASEAN to know that it has a rich, complicated, and dynamic history that I don't know very much about. But it's long seemed to me that across geographies, American governments have often been very susceptible to the following formula. We agree we have a problem. Here's what we're doing to solve the problem. What can we do together to solve the problem? There are two things that don't work, which I've seen a lot in other parts of the world. One is denying there's any problem that needs solving. No, things are fine. Pay attention somewhere else. And then the US starts arguing, yeah, no, things aren't fine, and you can never get any patterns of cooperation because you're arguing about the facts. The other is saying, here's a problem, and here's what you need to do to fix it. In many administrations, that breeds frustration. I think in this one, it's going to elicit anger. The way to see the current moment, I think, is to accept that we're in a time of flux and to think really in terms of what are the habits we want to instill? How do we want to use this period of dynamism, of openness, to create new patterns of cooperation, to create new possibilities that we haven't been thinking about because we never had to think about them? At a time when the United States is very uncertain about its own strategy, that creates an opportunity for friends to advance their own strategies to which the United States can contribute. My counsel would be not to wait until the United States decides on a new strategy, but instead to think through where do you want US strategy to be in 10 years and to build toward that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and important reminders to not make undue assumptions that the current state of things or the prior state of things with the Cold War necessarily structure how international institutions will behave and form in the future. Herman, would you like to offer some opening comments?
Thank you. And I joined the rest of the panel in thanking the organizers for inviting us to actually speak here. John started out with math in terms of time and space. Made me realize one thing. I'm getting old. When he talked about the idea of living through the Cold War, unfortunately, that's pretty much my own experience, right?
We're all getting old.
Well, there's that. But the thing that's actually interesting here is that when we talk about the idea of, and this goes back to the questions that were actually asked of us, is the question was, are we leaving behind the old order? So this is what Charmaine was actually talking about earlier on. And I think the interesting point here is that not really, right? Because as has been emphasized by the other panelists, we don't even know where we're going at this point in time. There's no consensus on where we're actually going. We know that we're going somewhere, but where is that, right? Are we leaving behind the old order? And the interesting thing here is that, in fact, we might emphasize things like, for instance, minilaterals that are actually emerging or being used, right, as ways by which you can undermine the old order. So you can talk about the SEO, for instance, and others, BRICS, and so on. We're open to the question of whether these are minilaterals or are they actually alternative multilateral arrangements, right? But the interesting point here is that, in fact, quite a number of efforts have actually been put into place to try to prop up the existing order. We can talk about the idea that we're leaving behind, that we are seeing a weakening of the liberal order, but attempts to actually strengthen it or to at least keep on propping it up, right, have been obvious. Things like AUKUS, things like that talk about arrangements that have to do with maintaining open trade systems within smaller arrangements. So, in fact, we are not leaving behind anything. We're seeing bits and pieces of the old order still being maintained and strengthened. Okay? There are aspects, of course, that have changed. No? The thing that we, and this goes back to what John was saying about our previous experience, which we've gotten used to, right? That the old order emphasized things like multilateralism, cooperation, institutions, right? And the question is whether those institutions are actually being undermined by changes that are actually taking place. Significant part of which has to do with, of course, a return to what we've referred to as great power politics, something that Charmaine was actually talking about earlier on. And in discussing that particular point, the interesting issue here is the extent to which it's exclusionary, right? The changes, the emergence of great power politics, and the things that are actually going on right now. And I'd say that there is an accommodation that's actually taking place as far as what countries are actually doing, in terms of trying to adjust to the emergence of great power politics, in particular, the competition between China and the United States. And of course, remember, the thing is when we're talking about the challenges to the liberal order, if you will, it's not just China, right? We're talking about the emergence of groups of countries that are actually, as Charmaine pointed out, disappointed with the kinds of things that have actually emerged out of that liberal order. Countries that have been left behind. And we're not just talking about countries that have been left behind, we're talking about people that have been left behind, right? And see, to a certain extent, that's the reason why you have the things that are going on in the United States, being instrumental to the way that the international order is actually being shaped right now. Which brings me to the second point, as far as the questions were concerned, right? How are countries that are not actually involved in this great power competition, or who want to be outside of that great power competition, trying to accommodate, right, these changes and trying to shift as far as the changes are concerned, right? The example that's actually given is, of course, ASEAN, right? If we take a look at the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, right, what it has actually tried to do is, this notion of ASEAN centrality was all about the notion of trying to actually make certain, right, that regional dynamics are actually going to be inclusive, the idea of actually pushing forward cooperation, okay, and to try to make sure that we're not going to be subject to the kinds of the more egregious effects of great power rivalries, as emphasized within the context of China and the United States. Okay, but can we do it, right? Can middle powers actually contribute to the shaping of what we're talking about as the emerging order, whatever that emerging order might be, right? The specific case of ASEAN actually shows one thing. Middle powers or small states are in a position to actually make that contribution to actually help in the shaping of the international order only when they act together, right? Meaning to say that countries in ASEAN, for instance, are bedeviled by the fact that there is if we talk about the idea of a lack of consensus on where we're going, right? ASEAN shows that particular problem, right? ASEAN states have not been able to actually come up with a common notion of what our strategic environment should be, right? And that lack of a consensus on where direction should actually head is contributing to the difficulties that ASEAN is facing in being able to actually contribute to the shaping of regional dynamics, right? And so the main problem that we actually have right now is that ASEAN centrality is to a large extent being undermined by or at least its ability to actually shape the region, is finding difficulty in terms of the being able to put itself in the middle of that competition between China and the United States. Okay. Which now, of course, brings us to the question, the continuing question of, okay, the Philippines, right? Where does it find itself here? And we've talked about the West Philippine Sea, okay? The nature of the relationship with China, no? And therefore, the question of how does this then actually affect, no, the chairmanship of ASEAN, no, in 2026, okay? For the Philippines, the issue, as far as this future is actually concerned, no, has to do, the immediate future is about making sure that we have a successful chairmanship, right? That successful chairmanship, however, no, will be constrained to a large extent by our relationship with China, okay? Whether China is actually going to push the envelope on the nature of our relationship, you know, the kinds of tensions that are actually emerging in the West Philippine Sea, no, is something that we will have to actually navigate, no, during our chairmanship. Okay? So the issue for us is how do we actually help guide ASEAN in terms of playing that role that we're talking about as far as trying to mitigate, no, the more egregious effects of the competition between China and the United States in the region, okay? While at the same time, no, being able to actually work, no, to actually maintain, no, our national interest, no, as far as the West Philippine Sea is concerned. It's a tightrope that we're actually walking, no, that we have to walk, and at this point in time, no, it's actually going to be something that we will have to make, no, very strong calculations on. But this is something that we can only do with the cooperation of the other ASEAN countries. And again, I bring back the point to the idea that ASEAN is only effective to the extent that its member states are actually able to act together to define what they think, no, the region should be, right? And how, no, it can act in the face of the intensifying competition between China and the United States. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Incredibly insightful comments from every member on the panel. I may abuse my privilege as moderator to just ask a question of the panel before we open up to the floor for questions from the audience. And I'd love to just go a little deeper on the institutions that you expect will guide and define this next age of international order. So we can think about the United Nations in terms of international organizations. There's regional institutions like ASEAN. Much focus has been given to the mini-lateral landscape, whether that's the Quad, or, for example, the partnership trilaterally between the Philippines, Japan, and the United States, which has done important work on maritime issues, economic security, and then there's the bilateral relationships as well, like the U.S.-Philippines alliance. And I wonder how you view kind of each of these types of institutions engaging and shaping the international engagement ahead. If we'd like to start with Derek again, we can run down the panel on that question.
Well, thank you. Big question. I think several folks have addressed it already, but I think it's a combination of a lot of new and creative efforts. I think bilateralism still is critical. Our alliance structure is our comparative advantage to adversaries. We have deep relationships with folks in Europe and in Asia that we would give up at our peril. I don't know where the Trump administration is moving on that front. I don't think, so far, it's been somewhat encouraging, in fact. It may not seem that way, but you know, some senior people come here from the new administration and reaffirmed some of the fundamentals. That's very important. I do agree with what others have said, which is the mini-lateral, the kind of coalitions to address particular issues. I think as the previous administration, the Biden administration did, I think is going to be more and more critical and important. It's not enough to just put together structures. I mean, I think some of these structures like the Quad were put together because they seem pretty great if we can get, you know, it started from the tsunami in 2004 and Abe pushed the idea of institutionalizing US, Japan, Australia, India. Great, bring India into the mix. There's talk of Indo-Pacific. That's great, institutionalize it, and it was kind of looking for, okay, now what do we do? And finding a purpose. It was a structure in search of a purpose. That is fine to a degree, but I think that purpose-driven, that mission-driven, what are we trying to achieve, and then build these coalitions around that with common norms, with common values, I think is likely to be the most productive way of approaching this going forward, because some of these, people just look at structures and say they're hollow. This is also something important without the United States. Think about it. The TPP was driven greatly by US energy. We should be doing this in Japan. And then the US pulled out. Both parties decided we weren't part of it. Japan picked it up and it exists as the CPTPP. There's the Chiang Mai Initiative in the 90s. I think about, there are ways that countries can come together during crises over particular needs and missions to form coalitions to deal with challenges. And that kind of creativity, that what we talked about, I guess, previously as lattice work of things like that, but without putting a label on it, I do think that that's important, and it's important that countries in the region think along these lines. They take ownership. What is it we need to achieve? What are we trying to achieve here? We can't simply rely on the hub and spoke, American benign hegemony, offshore balancing, important, but what can folks in the region do to contribute to it, and under what conditions? So I think that is likely to be important going forward, mission-driven type of coalitions more than just structures looking for purpose.
Again, I agree with Ambassador Mitchell. I would also add that we now see a plethora of different arrangements out there, whether that's bilateralism, multilateralism, minilateralism, trilateralism, etc. I don't think it's an either-or choice that states would just simply choose, either doing bilateralism or multilateralism. It's always, a fluidity of these different types of arrangements. And also, I don't think we should be hung up so much on the type of institutions or arrangements that we're involved in, but to be a little bit more mindful and conscious about how we interact and the values, the norms that we bring into the table when we enter into these kinds of arrangements.
Let me come at this from a little bit different angle, but I think it's pertinent. Toward the very end of the Cold War, I was working for Senator Moynihan, who was a senator from New York. He had been the UN ambassador. And he wrote a book called On the Law of Nations, which was partly a rehash of his doctoral dissertation at Tufts. But it had other things in it. And he has this line on the next to last page that says, small countries will hope that large countries will be law-abiding. Which I have come to think, the more I think about it, is a deeply profound insight. And I think as we think about the current environment, one of the things that I think is very distressing is a sense that the United States has become much less predictable than China, and it pushes both partners, allies, groups like ASEAN to think about how do we hedge against American uncertainty and American unpredictability and the lack of what we would think about as law-abiding to secure ourselves. And I think there's an important message there that first, groups like ASEAN have a keen interest in ensuring that the United States is more predictable, encouraging the United States to be more predictable, doing what it can to get the United States to be more predictable. But I think it also is a point that people like me have to continue to make to people in the US government. That if there's a sense that we are the most unpredictable actor in the world, that also has consequences for all of our partnerships. I remember in the years after 9/11, a senior executive from an oil company told me that the United States was the biggest driver of geopolitical uncertainty in the world. This is about 2004, 2005. I think that's a very dangerous place for the United States to be in. I think instead, the greatest advantage the United States has in the world is we have allies and partners that span the globe. And when our allies and partners don't know how to make us happy, I think that makes us weaker. When our allies and partners do know how to make us happy, there's still a negotiation about what happens. But I think it's a world and a structure that provides much more security to folks in Southeast Asia and elsewhere.
I'll follow through on what John was actually saying. The issue that we're actually facing right now, as far as the international order is actually concerned, and the significance of current institutions, their sustainability, is unfortunately actually dependent on the predictability of the United States. And I think Ambassador Mitchell talked about the idea that what we're actually facing right now actually goes beyond Donald Trump, right? Meaning to say that even if we don't have a Republican, MAGA administration following through on this current administration, that unpredictability is still going to be there. Meaning to say that we're talking about, an American public, an American polity, that can choose to vote for candidates, for administrations, who are not interested in maintaining the current order, right? In supporting current institutions, right? So, which basically means that it creates an imperative, it creates an incentive on the part of smaller states, of middle powers, to actually pursue their own institution building processes. Many of these institutions are probably going to be all about trying to prop up the current order, or at least bits and pieces of it within the context of their respective regions, right? But what we're seeing is that aspect of the liberal order, the dependence on the United States, the emphasis placed on the centrality of the United States in that order, is now being replaced by a sense that, unfortunately, if you talk about the idea of self-help, you get into a realist kind of thinking. But that's precisely what we're looking at now, that regional actors are looking at regional ways by which they can actually respond to this particular issue. The institutions that were built as far as the Bretton Woods system is concerned, that continued through, that are still there, I don't think they're going to disappear very quickly. But you might find that their significance is actually going to be replaced by more regional arrangements, by attempts to actually build cooperative arrangements within regions involving countries that have clearer commonalities as far as their interests are actually concerned. And therefore, we'll be seeing, I won't say an erosion of, right, but a de-emphasizing of the kind of institutional order that we actually have right now, to be replaced by, or to see the emergence of more localized, if you will, more regionalized arrangements that we might actually find would be the emphasis of these smaller states. Of course, all of this has to work within the context of the competition between China and the United States, right? And so one assumes that this kind of institution building is something that's going to take place within the context of the constraints imposed by the pressures of the current rivalry between China and the United States.
Thank you. We have just about 30 minutes left. I'd love to use that time to open the floor to any questions and comments from our members of the audience. So I think we do have some folks out there running mics to make sure we can hear you. So if people can please just put up a hand if you would like to pose a question to the panel. We'll look forward to your thoughts. I see a hand up here and then one back there up next. Thank you.
I'm an academic from De La Salle University. Charmaine Misalucha is my boss. So my question pertains to the fact that, can I raise two questions? Two very short questions, I'll make sure.
If they're very short.
Very short. When you talk about order, you talk about norms, values, but of course another element of an order is power. And of course, new orders are created on the basis of contestation of power, or sometimes we could talk about war. Of course, when we talk about the new, the order when after the United Nations was created, was Second World War, then we talk about the order now, we talk about the Cold War. So where do you see the role of order and possibly, of course, contestation in terms of great powers through force happening in the near future? Or if it will not happen, what could be an option to prevent it from happening? That's it. Thank you.
Thank you. A great question on how we think about the relevance of power and force in the context of values and norms we've been discussing so far. Anyone?
Yeah. No, in fact, it's something, as I sort of gave a summary in my opening remarks, I neglected, which is the foundation of all of this is power. Always has been. Let's be honest about it. I mean, norms and values, the reason why you can enforce those norms and values is because a preponderance of power. And that can come in various forms. It could be hard power, as you talk about, or soft power, or whatever. But power still drives international affairs. There's no getting around that, and that is a foundation of order. And as you see the rise of other major powers, and certainly in this region there's a major power, the need for the United States to keep up with our allies and with other partners to balance that, both in the normative, soft power sense, attractive power, as well as the hard power, is absolutely essential. And when folks who want to change the status quo and have recidivist intentions, they have to be stood up to. There has to be a deterrent. There has to be a military. Otherwise, countries will decide where is the power headed, where is the balance of power moving. Smaller countries will make their judgments based on who has the commitment, will, and intention, and capability to back up the order with power. There's no question about that. I should have mentioned that myself in my introduction. It's very good that you mentioned this. And it gets to another point, too, which is Chinese and the Russians, and I think it extends on what Herman was talking about. They're on the offensive right now. I mean, they're out there shaping. They're engaging out there trying to shape in some way a new order or challenging our order or whatever it is. They're putting together new coalitions. And we're on the defensive. And our norms are on the defensive. Democracies are on the defensive. Democracy is on the defensive. And I think we have to gather ourselves and look at all of these elements of order and be more, I don't know with our administration, but be more confident, be more assertive and more strategic about how we build. How do we listen to our partners more? Because it's going to rely on having willing partners who are going to recognize the power balance is not the hyperpower of the United States that was very attractive. It was post-World War II, based on certain political and economic norms, or today based on other types of norms. But we now have to be more equal in that sense of the conversation. But what kind of world in the United States needs to be backing that up with the power that you suggest and the will to use it?
John, what would you add?
Let me just pick up on your question. I think you've actually highlighted a very important point, which is that Americans, when they think about power, assume that people will contest American power the way Americans want them to contest American power, in ways Americans are strong. And it's my perception that most countries that are hostile to the United States undermine American power by attacking it from other places in asymmetric ways that Americans are often slow to appreciate. And here's, I think, a role for ASEAN, because you do have a sense for how the region feels and what's happening here, that you can help sensitize Americans to ways in which other countries are making inroads, advancing their own strengths in ways that aren't purely military, in ways that aren't purely economic, but are more subtle, are more indirect, are planting seeds. I think Americans are used to people contesting us in ways we are overwhelmingly strong. And the reality is countries that are in conflict with the United States are smart enough not to attack the areas that are heavily fortified, but to undermine areas that Americans aren't paying attention to. And again, there's a role for ASEAN in helping us understand how the world feels when you get outside of the United States.
Herman.
If I'm going to answer Rene's question and put it down into into a particular area, right? The contestation, if you will, in the West Philippine Sea that actually involves, I mean, West Philippine Sea is not just the Philippines and the and China at this point in time. You're really seeing the whole of the South China Sea as an arena where this rivalry between China and the United States is actually playing out, right? And in fact, the diplomatic gambits that are actually going on, to a certain extent, is finding that particular competition in the way that the issue of the South China Sea is actually being drawn out. The interesting thing here is the extent to which you can see that that particular competition, power, between China and the United States, is shaping the whole dynamic within the context of Southeast Asia. If we're talking about what can be done, I'd agree, ASEAN has a potential for this. The problem that I see, however, is the extent to which the ASEAN countries, have a common sense of, how they should actually work towards, work with this particular, within the context of this competition, right, this rivalry, right? The fact that ASEAN countries are divided, if you will, in the way that they see who's actually responsible for creating trouble, in the region, whether it's the United States or China, creates a difficulty as far as ASEAN being able to act as a mitigating actor, as far as the effects of this rivalry is actually concerned. This is actually the difficulty of the Philippines when it takes on the chairmanship of ASEAN next year. That this is not just about trying to shape how ASEAN is actually, or at least drive the idea of a successful chairmanship within the context of China's participation. This actually has to do with certain issues as well, that goes beyond ASEAN, but actually is all about ASEAN's role within Southeast Asia, right? Whether the Philippines is going to be in a position to shape ASEAN's role in that way, is actually a heady question, I think, at this point in time, right? And again, it's a question of whether the Philippines can help shape the way that ASEAN comes to a consensus on what the region should be, how the region should actually be behaving, or at least should be acting within the context of that relationship between China and the United States is actually part of this whole calculation that we need to do as far as peace and security in the region is concerned.
Let's go to our next question in the back. Thank you.
Good morning,
sorry.
sirs and ma'ams. I'm Eugene Texon from National Security Council Secretariat of the Philippines. Thank you for inviting us to this Manila Strategy Forum, and thank you also for the insightful views from our panelists. My question is, how do certain current developments affect our direction towards this evolving international order that we have, given that most of our panelists have said that we are not certain where we are heading to with respect to our international order. These developments I would cite, for instance, the expansion of the BRICS, and then we have a formation such as the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, wherein China, Russia, and India showed that they are committed to cooperate towards each other. And then developments in Africa, for instance, because we have many countries here that are constantly affected by global terrorism and also humanitarian crisis. And also some of these countries are affected by shifts in terms of how they cooperate with great powers, depending on to whom they benefit or to whom do they see that they would cooperate more in the long term. For instance, we have Burkina Faso that has recently emerged as the #1 country most affected by global terrorism. Globally, they have shifted cooperation from US and France to Russia. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's start with Charmaine on that question of the SCO, BRICS, other regional organizations that play increasingly important roles in this international order, and of course, welcome any additional thoughts on the prior question of power as well.
Sure. Thanks for that. With these new types of arrangements that you mentioned, the SCO, the BRICS, and all of those things, how they might impact the international order, I think we need to put this into context of how the rules-based order is currently being challenged or contested. So as I mentioned in my remarks, we could look at this from the perspective of either, is this an applicatory kind of contestation or a validity contestation? If it's applicatory, this would actually strengthen the current order because it indicates that there are different types of arrangements and organizations and institutions. But if it undermines the veracity, the validity of the current order and presents themselves as alternatives, then it may spell the ultimate demise of the current order. And to go back to Professor De Castro's question earlier, I mean, clearly power is still central to discussions of orders and transitions of order. It is actually hard power that creates new orders, but the perpetuation and maintenance of orders depends on soft power. And this is also where norms and values would come in.
Perhaps, John, would you like to weigh in on the question of these newer regional organizations, SCO, BRICS, how Africa plays a role?
I mean, it seems to me they're all opportunistic, and they're doing, in many ways, what I thought would be a potential role for ASEAN. Think about where you want to be in 10 years and build toward that. What's interesting about BRICS in particular is the more I talk to people who are involved in BRICS, the less I understand they agree on what BRICS is or will be. Each of them seems to see a possibility. I think that the Chinese and the Russians have mostly compatible ideas about what they're trying to drive it to, but I sense profound resistance, not only among the Indians and the Brazilians, but all the way down. That's, this remarkable moment of plasticity in the world. I don't think we really appreciate it. I was trained as a historian, and one of the challenges historians have is remembering that when everybody's making decisions, you don't know how they're going to turn out, right? Everybody always sort of reads history and you know what the ending is when you're going through it. But I think we are in a remarkable historical period now. Tremendous uncertainty about how order is going to play out. And I think that rewards people who can imagine, how do I use some of these regional organizations, some of these other kinds of organizations to support building toward a different outcome. I don't think any of this is foreordained, and I think it's going to be a combination of creativity and effort that are going to help create where this order is, and I think these regional organizations can play a very substantial role creating that kind of order, buttressing a different order, which, as I say, I hope will have more dynamism and resilience than the order that we have gotten used to, and I think in some ways has become a shell after 70 some odd years of people taking it for granted.
And as we continue this discussion, I might just layer a question of my own on top. When we think about the role that SEO, that BRICS play in broader international order, they often seem to be norm-setting organizations, and I think those norms would worry many of us in this room. But I think the way in which those ideas, common future for mankind, are translated into concrete policy on the part of China or Russia or others is often unclear. And so would also welcome your thoughts about how those organizations affect not just the idea of order, but what that really means on a tactical way.
I think that's right. And it seems to me that so much of what BRICS is doing is actually framing things, framing problems, framing arguments, framing what solutions might look like, not doing them, but creating a vocabulary. One of the interesting things is, for example, how much the phrase global south has made it into the vocabulary of especially China and India, I think meaning different things, but it's a framing exercise. And China means to frame it differently from the way India means to frame it. But I think in both cases, there really is an effort. You create common vocabulary. You create a sort of nature of the problem that then lends itself to certain solution sets and excludes other solution sets.
That's a great point. Herman, what would you add?
I agree with the idea that this requires a certain that the idea of BRICS and SEO actually, provides an alternative, or at least an attempt to reframe, relationships. Of course, the interesting thing here is that we're talking about organizations that at this point in time, are still amorphous as far as their objectives are actually concerned, right? The common theme for them is really to challenge elements of the existing order, right? To provide suggestions on institutional forms, that would actually put some sort of flesh to those ideas. But as to whether or not we're going to see at this point in time, clearly, one of the more exciting, if you will, ideas that came out of BRICS was the idea of trying to de-dollarize, the international financial system, right? There's nothing there yet, but that was one of the more interesting aspects, of what the BRICS was actually discussing, precisely because if you think about American hegemony and the things that actually maintains the liberal order, right? A key part of it is dominance over financial structures, right? And that includes things like, for instance, the way that trade is actually largely conducted through the US dollar as the main currency, right? The dollarization of the trade system, especially amongst the big BRICS countries, is a singular effort, or idea that actually challenges, a key element, as far as the existing order actually is concerned, right? But again, how it's going to be done, whether you're going to see a common set of ideas, no, and policies towards that objective, no, is something that we're not seeing yet, right? So right now, it's normative precisely because there are certain ideas that are actually being framed within these organizations, right? But the operational aspect of it is still something that's actually quite unclear.
Derek?
Yeah, just a couple points. I agree with my colleagues that I see BRICS, as I mentioned in my opening, my comment, as a symptom. It's a symptom of this issue of inclusion, that folks like being part of BRICS because they get included in a conversation in an order that they felt excluded from, that was dominated by the United States. And so here they have the opportunity to be in the room, major power, number one, to be included and talk about issues that affect them. One of which I didn't mention earlier, was the issue of sovereignty. It's the one thing I think that unites a lot of the major powers. They want to prevent overweening American, the de-dollarization is meant to prevent the United States from using the dollar to coerce other countries with sanctions. So again, it's sort of a function of a desire to maintain an absolute sense of national sovereignty, not have to be actually burdened by rules, certainly rules that are imposed by the United States, and be part of these organizations because there's a demand for inclusion. And the United States and the West has not met that demand. So we can't fight. I think these things are symptomatic of something broader out there. There should be a wake-up call to the West that we need to be quicker in thinking about how do we include more, that we have been inclusive in many ways, but we need to be opening up the aperture, listening more, and recognizing that, as always, the international atmosphere is evolving, and we need to get with that program. The second quick point is, you talk about the Chinese, and the Chinese with their initiatives out there. China wants to dominate these, right? They want to dominate BRICS. And I have a sense the Indians don't want the Chinese to dominate or be the normative foundation with the global governance, development, security, and civilizational initiatives. So within, there's a lot of challenge about what this actually is going to mean affirmatively beyond these very vague and very broad principles. The Chinese want this to be their platform to be leaders, and they're going to have to, I think there's going to be a lot of resistance to that. And already you're seeing folks sort of check the box and saying, yes, I believe in these initiatives. They're putting their statements, but they see what the Chinese actions are. The Chinese actions are not what their rhetoric suggests they are. And I think countries are still very uncomfortable, or latently uncomfortable, with the Chinese being leaders of this.
It's a great point. And you see that even in the very warm meeting that Indian Prime Minister Modi had with President Xi in Tianjin, where still, if you look at the two readouts of the meetings, the Indians are talking about a multipolar Asia, and Beijing is talking about a multipolar world, which implies Beijing's hegemony in the region, which India, of course, cannot accept. So it is interesting to see how those fissures continue to deepen even in a relatively warm moment in that relationship.
And the Indians didn't stick around for the parade because they have a little problem on their border. Yeah.
Let's go back to the floor. Any further questions? Okay, I see a hand in the center.
Thank you. This is from Taiwan, Taipei Economy Culture Office, Michael Lee. Yes, 1 week ago, the China Tiananmen Square, the military parade is threat other countries, threat a small country. And Russia and North Korea and Xi Jinping together is also broken the international law. So here we should understand the threat very clear. So my question is, the one is how we can work together. How we can work together against China provocative and activity and the military threat in the West Philippine Sea and Taiwan Strait. Second one is how is the U.S. leadership can continue to enhance Southeast Asia countries and First Island chain countries to against and together include the South and hardware. Thank you.
Thank you. For the sake of time, maybe let's see if there's one more question out there. I see one up front, and then we'll respond to both questions together.
Good morning. I'm Rob Bolivar from the Department of Foreign Affairs in the Philippines. Thank you for the insightful comments this morning. And the the focus of the discussions has so far been on state power and interstate relations, and of course that's understandable because given the topic that we have. But there was an interesting article a couple of months ago in Foreign Affairs entitled "The Technopolar Paradox," and it was talking about the role of the Elon Musks, the Sam Altmans, the Mark Zuckerbergs, in terms of influencing or upending what we now know as the international world order. So if the panelists can comment briefly on what kind of role, do they have a role, how big of a role do they have or are playing in defining this new international world order? Thank you.
Thank you. Important question. Perhaps we can go in reverse order. This time, Herman, would you like to begin the discussion?
Okay. Elon Musk, Tesla. The important thing here, I think, if we talk about the possible effects or at least influence of tech billionaires basically on international order, is the extent to which they've been able to act not through state agencies, but through their own businesses, for instance, right? Elon Musk being able to actually set up his own space exploratory company, for instance, which basically means that they are exhibiting what used to be, or at least the ability to actually consolidate and use resources in ways that used to be something that only states could do, right? So it brings in the possibility of what is it that individual persons with that kind of capacity to consolidate resources can do to influence international relations. Right now, we're not yet seeing the full potential of what it is that they can do, but they do have that kind of capability, right, to shape. I mean, if you think about it, the thing that George Soros was actually doing in terms of trying to shape the way that the post-Soviet Union development of Russia is actually along the same lines, right? The idea of actually using private resources, or at least resources that are actually outside of state influence, to be able to shape certain aspects of how foreign relations can actually be conducted. So which basically means that the potential is there, how it's actually going to be done. I'm thinking in terms of Terminator and things like that, right? But I think this is the point, right? You can see that the billionaires that we're seeing in the world are actually able to consolidate resources in a way that we've not seen in previous decades, which actually creates now a possible a different dimension as far as the way that international relations are actually conducted. So I can't say what it is that they can do at this point, but they do have the potential for influencing the way that states actually conduct their foreign relations, right? But again, remember that all politics is still local, if you will, or domestic, right? So the starting point would be how those resources can actually influence the way that states might actually be able to shape their policies as far as foreign relations is actually concerned. On the question of the South China Sea, right? If we actually think about it, what is it that can be done, as far as U.S. and Southeast Asia is concerned? Okay, one of the things that I've seen as far as my studies have actually concerned, is that the U.S. in its relations with ASEAN countries, right? Actually, it does a sort of pick and choose kind of partnership, meaning to say that it doesn't really work with ASEAN as an institutional form. It works with member countries of ASEAN that it sees a commonality in terms of perspective, right? So when the Biden administration, for instance, was talking about allies within the region, and it talked about ASEAN. In fact, it was talking about certain members of ASEAN that it could actually work with, right? The Philippines, obviously, right? But the potential of Vietnam, no, as far as partnerships was part of that whole calculation. But it was not really talking about the idea of ASEAN, no, as a partner, knowing the kinds of limitations, no, that kind of attempts to work its Southeast Asian policy might actually be concerned. So one of the things that's interesting is the way by which the U.S. might actually look at ASEAN rather than looking at the ASEAN member states individually, as potential partners in whatever strategy that it actually adopts towards Southeast Asia.
Let me address this very interesting issue of the role of technology and corporations in setting foreign policy. Obviously, we're in a very different place than we were when colonial interests basically determined what foreign policy was, Dutch East India Company, all those things. I think that we went through a long period where there were specific corporate interests that would shape a country's attitude toward another country, whether it's southern farmers planting cotton didn't want the U.S. building a high dam in Egypt because it would suppress cotton prices. You have that kind of thing. I think what is different about the current technology businesses is that their interest is largely in regulation and not in international affairs, but they have profound influence in government because of the effects of technology on society, which are incidental to their making money, right? So it's not that they want to shape what U.S. policy is toward any issue, or what the Philippine government's policy is to any foreign policy issue. It's that they want to develop this resource, which I'm sure many of you have heard, information is the new oil. I don't think it's true. But there is this interest in changing the nature of society, changing the nature of economies, which will have an effect on international relations. But in a weird way, it's incidental to the business interest of developing the technology. I think that puts us in a very different space because their interest is really sort of is much narrower, but their impacts are much broader. And I think that's a big shift from the way corporations have related to governments any time up to now.
An argument can be made that we actually find ourselves in this predicament precisely because we've been so focused solely on state-to-state interactions where a lot of our relationships are zero-sum and your win is at my loss. So we find ourselves in this predicament precisely because we've been stuck in this Westphalian, state-based order. But that being said, there's actually room for non-state actors, and not just big corporations, but also civil society organizations to help shape the agenda of the current order. And I think that would be a good segue to how we can further cooperate, not necessarily to work against China, but maybe to further our own common interests. So for instance, in terms of in maritime security, for instance, there is room for us to cooperate in terms of maritime environmental resources, how to protect coastal communities that will involve states, obviously, but also non-state actors.
Just to comment, I think from a different angle, the digital sphere to me is just we haven't talked about that here. You have to talk about digital in any conversation because of the massive impact it has on the world. We talk sort of on very traditional terms in terms of order, but it's a new weapon of mass opportunity, AI, as well as a weapon of mass destruction, potentially, which requires a cooperation that is unique. And yet what we're leaning towards, where we're headed towards in the digital space, is much more stratification of differences, where you have one set of norms in one part of the world, in certain countries, completely different set of norms in another part of the world. I'm talking about one part of the world, another part of the world. And so this idea of one open internet ideal that was pushed by the original, the founders of this, it's going to open up, it's going to connect people. It's now being obviously subverted, used for oppression, for control, and for subversion of our own open societies, the information operations. What John talked about in terms of recognizing how China will be attacking us at our weaker points in asymmetrical ways, where they are going at our information space, how we understand reality. We're doing that to ourselves, inside our own countries. Certainly the Philippines is subject to this in your elections recently, a lot of that from China and elsewhere. The United States, it's all over the news, how long that's been going on from the Russians and others. So the requirement that the titans of industry, particularly in the digital sphere, the masters of the universe who are now leading this digital revolution in the 21st century, it can be and should be a massive opportunity for us. And it should be a place where we both recognize, we all recognize the dangers of succumbing to an AI or an AGI world. We're not seeing that yet because we're so at odds over certain norms and ideals. And that's what worries me enormously going forward. But so at the tactical level, as well as the strategic level, this question that you raise is absolutely essential and probably deserves its own conference.
With that, we are very nearly out of time, but I want to provide each of our panelists with an opportunity to offer a brief concluding remark reflecting on the discussions this morning. Herman, would you like to begin?
I don't think there's anything more that I can add. It's, again, just to emphasize the point that the idea of actually building a different order, especially within the context of Southeast Asia, really requires the participation of small and medium countries, right? ASEAN has an important role to play in this context. But like I said, the issue is the extent to which ASEAN is going, or the members of ASEAN can actually formulate a common sense of where they actually want the region to actually go. This is where I think if the Philippines is to play a leadership role as far as its chairmanship of ASEAN is concerned, then this might be something that it has to take into consideration. Whether it's in a position to actually do so, of course, depends on the way that it navigates its relationship between China and, of course, the United States. Thank you.
I think this panel has reinforced my sense that rather than try to prop up what we've known and become comfortable with, we need to think with increasing energy and creativity toward what might be and how we can work toward something new and dynamic in the future rather than trying to recover the stability of the past.
It's been highlighted in extant literature and scholarship that we find ourselves today in what is called an interregnum. We're in between two different orders where we don't know what's going or how the new order will unfold. But it is definitely up to us, great powers, middle powers, small powers, to help define the emerging new order. So we need to be more mindful about how we interact with others. We need to be more mindful and conscious about the norms, the values that we are putting forth as we interact with each other.
Just to conclude, I completely affirm that point. I believe that very strongly, that we need to be on the offensive. I think we're largely on the defensive these days. The values, the norms that underwrite our societies and others of our allies have underwritten peace and security and development, allowed a lot of the illiberal countries to grow. And we need to be much more confident and much more equal in our conversations and listening to one another and ensuring that inclusion is the norm going forward. And finally, just to say, from the United States perspective, I completely agree with what John had said about the United States, that we are reluctant hegemons, as it were, that it's not normal for the United States, really, throughout our history, to be as fully engaged in the world and active and imperial. We are and we aren't. We have that in our DNA, too. But I do have to say, and I looked it up this morning because I thought about this question, that the polls say that a consistent, though dwindling majority, but a consistent, robust majority of Americans believe in American robust engagement in the world. That's on trade, that's on alliances, that's all of that. So we need to remember that. The American people, for all of their reluctance, there is a desire not to overreach, not to do too much, not to be in endless wars, not to, we do want our partners to step up, like the Philippines has and others have. But Americans are not, regardless of what the administration suggests, don't misunderstand, that Americans still believe in a very robust place in engagement with the world. And I think that, with creativity and more optimism, and more being on the offensive, gives me a little bit of hope going forward, regardless of what we're seeing in the headlines.
Thank you. And with that, we are out of time. So let me thank our wonderful panelists, Derek, Charmaine, Herman, and John again. Perhaps we can give them a round of applause. A really great discussion to start the day. And let me just thank again the CSIS Southeast Asia program and Greg Pulling for bringing us together for this incredible conversation and many more to come over the course of these 2 days. So up next, we have lunch. So please take about an hour to get lunch, and we'll ask you to be back in your seats for the next session by 12:05 p.m. Thanks so much.